On the night of June 10, 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa, was plunged into a chilling nightmare. The Moore family, peacefully sleeping in their beds, became the unsuspecting victims of a horrific act of violence that would forever leave a mark on the town's history. Inside the cozy home, Josiah and Sarah Moore, loving parents, were fast asleep upstairs. Their 4 children, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, were also tucked in for the night. On the first floor, their guest room hosted 2 girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, who were spending the night for a sleepover. The 8 had spent the day at a local church celebrating Children's Day, an event Sarah helped plan. Sometime around midnight, an intruder quietly entered the Moore family's home through the unlocked front door. In the small, peaceful town of Villisca, unlocked doors were not uncommon, as crime was virtually unheard of. No one could have foreseen the horrific act of violence that was about to unfold. Undeterred by the dark house, the stranger grabbed an oil lamp from a nearby table, adjusting the wick to produce a dim, flickering glow. With one hand, the stranger held the lamp. In the other, he clutched an axe, its heavy weight a silent promise of the brutal violence to come. With stealth, the intruder crept up the stairs to the room where the Moore parents lay sleeping. With a swift, brutal blow, the intruder struck Josiah Moore, before turning his weapon on Sarah. Undetected, the intruder made his way to the children's room. With evil brutality, the intruder repeated his gruesome act on each child, violently taking 4 more innocent souls. Unfinished, the stranger descended the stairs, leaving behind a trail of blood and devastation. In the guest room, he found the Stillinger sisters still asleep. Without remorse, he raised the axe. Lena and Ina also met their tragic end in the Moore home. As silently as they arrived, the intruder vanished into the night. The next morning, neighbors grew worried as the morning chores at the Moore home were left untouched. With the family unresponsive and the door locked, neighbors called Josiah's brother. Ross Moore arrived at his brother's home and called for someone inside. After repeatedly knocking, he opened the door with his copy of the key and began to look around. As he entered the guest bedroom, he discovered an unimaginable horror and called for neighbors to bring the police. This once peaceful town would be forever haunted by the Villisca Axe Murders, a brutal crime that has etched itself into the history of American crime. Henry Horton, Villisca's primary peace officer, promptly arrived at the scene, where a gruesome discovery awaited him. His search of the house confirmed neighbors' fears. The entire Moore family and the 2 Stillinger girls had been mercilessly bludgeoned to death. The murder weapon, an axe belonging to Josiah, lay abandoned in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters had been found. Medical examiners determined the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 a.m. The brutality of the attacks was evident. Josiah Moore, in particular, bore the brunt of the killer's rage, receiving the most blows of all the victims in the home. The ceiling in his room bore gouge marks, suggesting the crazed ferocity of the intruder's axe swings. Investigators noted that the killer had employed a chilling distinction in their method of murder, using the blade of the axe on Sarah Moore while resorting to the blunt end for the rest of the victims. The Moore children were bludgeoned in the head in the same merciless manner as their parents. The murderer then returned to the master bedroom, unleashing further blows upon the elder Moores, before descending to the guest bedroom, where the Stillingers met with the same brutal end. Investigators would discover more disturbing details, adding to the horror of this crime. In a disturbing display, the killer had placed a 4-pound slab of bacon from the Moores' icebox alongside the murder weapon, an act that seemed to mock the tragedy that had just unfolded. Untouched food and bloody water suggested the killer moved freely through the Moore home after committing his heinous crimes. Investigators also noted that mirrors in the home had been covered as if the killer did not want to see his reflection. However, authorities made a crucial misstep that would compromise the integrity of the investigation. They allowed people into the house to assess their potential involvement in the murders. This grave error in judgment resulted in the contamination of the crime scene, hindering the collection of crucial evidence. Investigators hypothesized that all the victims, except for Lena Stillinger, had been asleep at the time of the attack. Lena's defensive wounds, evident from the lacerations on her arm, and her crosswise position on the bed, suggest she had been awake and attempted to fight back. Despite the evidence and dozens of potential suspects who emerged during the investigation, authorities were unable to conclusively prove the identity of the killer. Police interviewed numerous persons of interest throughout the investigation, even taking one suspect to trial twice. However, despite the leads and theories, no one was ever formally charged with the murders. In the aftermath of the horrific Villisca Axe Murders, law enforcement scoured the area for any strangers or unfamiliar individuals who might have been passing through town at the time of the killings. One individual who fit this description was Andy Sawyer. Sawyer's erratic behavior and morbid fascination with the murders raised suspicions among his peers. His boss, concerned about Sawyer's habit of sleeping fully clothed with an axe in his hand, reported him to the sheriff. Despite being detained, Sawyer was eventually released after it was discovered he had been arrested for vagrancy in Osceola, Iowa, on the night of the murders. The investigation also turned its focus on Frank F. Jones, an esteemed member of the community and an Iowa state senator. Jones had a history of business dealings with Josiah Moore, who had previously worked for him. When Moore left to start his own business, he reportedly took a lucrative contract with him. Rumors also circulated about an alleged affair between Moore and Jones' daughter-in-law, though no evidence ever substantiated this claim. While no formal charges were ever filed against Senator Jones, his connection to other persons of interest and the lingering doubts surrounding his involvement in the case continued to cast a shadow over his reputation. Suspicions surrounding Senator Jones intensified with allegations that he hired William Mansfield to carry out the murders. This theory gained traction due to striking similarities between the Villisca murders and a series of similar axe murders that occurred in nearby towns, raising the chilling possibility of a serial killer operating in the region. Driven by an unwavering belief in Mansfield's guilt, Detective James Newton Wilkerson embarked on a relentless pursuit of justice. He gathered evidence linking Mansfield to the axe murders in Colorado Springs, Colorado, Ellsworth, Kansas, and Paola, Kansas. In each case, the victims were brutally bludgeoned to death with an axe, their homes left in silence, and the mirrors covered. However, payroll records placed Mansfield in Illinois at the time of the Villisca killings. With this alibi, Mansfield was released from custody. Undeterred by this setback, Wilkerson continued to press for justice, alleging that Senator Jones' influence had swayed the investigation's outcome. Despite the lack of conclusive evidence, Wilkerson remained convinced of Mansfield's guilt, pointing to his knowledge of his fingerprints being on file at the federal military prison in Leavenworth, a detail that would have made him acutely aware of the need to wear gloves at the crime scenes. However, there were several other suspects that investigators linked as a possible killer. Henry Lee Moore, unrelated to the Moore victims, also emerged as a potential suspect in the Villisca murders, as well as several other killings across the United States. His modus operandi, involving the use of an axe and the brutal murder of victims, bore striking similarities to the Villisca crime. Prior to Villisca, Moore committed similar axe murders on his mother and grandmother. The similarities in these cases fueled suspicions that Moore was a serial killer responsible for a string of axe murders. In Colorado Springs, an inquest was held for a similar murder following reports a man resembling Moore had been seen in the city after the killings. Another inquest was launched in Lafayette, Louisiana, to investigate a 1911 axe murder. However, in both cases, evidence cast doubts on Moore's involvement. Regarding the Villisca murders, many residents remained skeptical of Moore's involvement. However, Joseph Stillinger, father of the slain sisters, claimed that Moore resembled a man who had once worked for him for a week before disappearing, which raised further suspicions. Despite these connections, Moore was never definitively linked to the Villisca murders or other cases. However, the idea that these murders were connected to a serial killer put another suspect into investigators' sights. In their book, The Man from the Train, Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James present a theory that the Villisca axe murders were just one of many killings committed by a single serial killer, Paul Muller. Muller, an immigrant possibly from Germany, had previously been the subject of an unsuccessful manhunt as the sole suspect in the 1897 murder of a family in Massachusetts. The James's theory stems from extensive research into archival newspaper stories detailing dozens of similar murders across the United States. They believe Muller was responsible for at least 59 deaths in 14 separate incidents, including the Villisca murders. The duo identified several similarities in these crimes, such as the murders taking place while the victims were asleep, with the blunt side of an axe, which was left behind at the crime scene. The victims were all covered after they were killed, and the killer locked up the home before they left. It was also pointed out that the targeted families all lived near railroad tracks, suggesting the killer traveled by train. While Muller was never definitively linked to the Villisca murders, the James's research highlights the disturbing possibility of a serial killer operating undetected for over a decade. Authorities had another suspect in mind. Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher with a history of peculiar behavior and indiscretions, became a focal point of suspicion in the murders. Kelly arrived in Villisca on June 8, 1912, to teach at the Children's Day services. The Moore family attended the same festivities on June 9. It was also reported that he left town between 5 o'clock and 5:50 a.m. on June 10, a few hours before the bodies were discovered. Over the following weeks, Kelly became fascinated with the case, writing letters to investigators and family members of the victims. Suspicious, investigators asked Kelly for any details he might have, which he provided with great detail. However, his history of mental illness made authorities question his reliability. Reverend Kelly was arrested for the Villisca murders in 1917. Police obtained a confession from him, however, it was after hours of interrogation, and Kelly later recanted. Kelly faced trial for the murders twice. In both cases, he was acquitted. While Kelly was never definitively proven guilty of the Villisca axe murders, his presence in the town on that fateful night and his subsequent actions continue to fuel speculation about his involvement. The Villisca axe murders remain one of the most chilling unsolved crimes in American history. 8 people, including 6 children, were brutally murdered in their beds on the night of June 9, 1912. The crime shook the small town of Villisca, Iowa, and sent shockwaves across the nation. Despite an extensive investigation, no one was ever definitively proven guilty of the murders. Several suspects emerged over the years, including Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who was in Villisca on the night of the killings. Kelly was eventually acquitted twice, but the cloud of suspicion has never fully lifted from him. Other suspects, like Frank Jones and William Mansfield, possessed the means and motives to commit the crime but were never formally charged. And a string of similar crimes across the United States raises the gruesome possibility that the Villisca murders were part of a larger pattern of serial violence. The case of the Villisca axe murders remains the subject of speculation and debate, and there are still many questions that remain unanswered. What happened on that fateful night in Villisca? The Villisca Axe Murders are a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist in the world. They are a reminder that even in the most peaceful and idyllic places, evil can lurk.